Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 is a game that has been out for a decent bit now, but maybe I'm just impatient and really excited after such a well-built second chapter, because I already have been sitting here waiting for some information on what Chapter 3 may contain. And while of course we are long from talking about release dates, trailers, or anything of that nature, we actually surprisingly found out a decent bit of information relating to what Poppy Playtime's third chapter will look like in terms of lore, and maybe even a slight bit of gameplay as well. So to go back really fast, I'm sure we all remember Chapter 1, the one where we run from the demonic being by the name of Huggy Wuggy, and at this point we actually found out a lot about the lore despite there not being much visibly present. We were able to pretty convincingly theorize that all the characters that were haunted in this factory were experiments with the goal of turning fake toys into real-life beings, very similar to things like Bendy and the Ink Machine. Anyway, at this point already we heard devastating news about a character who was just labeled as Experiment 1006. The experiment went wrong, people died, and so on. Now with all that being said, we have only met two characters face-to-face at this time, Huggy and Poppy. And of the two, Poppy seemed to be the less hostile and, dare I say, friendly one, while Huggy obviously literally tries to kill us throughout the entire chapter. So it seemed like everything was working out in terms of theories. Huggy was the devastating 1006 experiment, Poppy was theorized to be the perfect version of these experiments, and as for all the other toys and experiments, well, we were just gonna have to wait until Chapter 2 to find things out. And find things out we did. From this point forward, the entire video is pretty much all theoretical, so some things here may be a bit mixed and mashed, but here we go. In Chapter 2, we need to access the train station to escape with the Poppy doll helping us out along the way. Only problem is along the way she gets trapped by the character named Mommy Longlegs, who forces us to go through dangerous tasks in exchange for codes to a train station that we need to escape. Well, that is until she gets herself stuck in a grinder and proceeds to die right in front of our eyes. From this point forward, in the end, we enter the train where Poppy actually turns against us and reveals her real intentions to use us to help her be freed. The chapter seemed to tie up pretty nicely, and that was that. But the thing is, there's a lot more confusing stuff about the story happening behind the scenes that we can only find out through some incredibly subtle clues across the map. And for the sake of discovering what we know, we need to focus on the antagonist of this chapter, of course being Mommy Longlegs. Obviously, she is not the nicest character out there. She essentially spends the entire game just teasing us with mini clues towards the train station's code, while also putting us through various dangerous tasks including fighting Bunzo Bunny and Simon Says, and also forcing us to fight against a bunch of mini Huggy Wuggies in Whack-A-Wuggy. Anyway, Mommy Longlegs clearly doesn't seem to be the nicest character towards us. But despite her description by the employees of her being like a caregiver to the other experiments, she also seems to be a bit harsh on them as well. Because excluding Pugapillar, whenever we end up beating the experiments in their mini games, she simply put just kills them. I guess that means she really didn't want us to get past. But anyway, while going through the chapter, similar to the first, we find multiple tapes across it that give an insight into the lore of the game once again. This time, it's clear the lore is a bit deeper, and better yet, it gives more specifics as to what's happened. Because even though we did, as noted, theorize in the first chapter what we know now about the experimenting from humans to these dolls, we get a lot more insight into the specifics of these experiments. For example, we find tests across the map of other individuals who were playing the same games that we were for the entire chapter with different scores written down based on their performance. Also, it's very important to note that in these test descriptions, we get people's names, along with the toys that they have been assigned to. Anyway, at this point, we were still constantly being reminded throughout this chapter about Experiment 1006 and the prototype. But while, of course, at first a lot of people thought this was Huggy because he was our first and only hostile encounter at the time, we would eventually find out a new discovery that would leave even more questions than answers. So whenever we last meet with Mommy Longlegs, she had thrown her teasing out the window and had full-blown attacked us. But in the end, she failed, and she ended up getting herself stuck inside of this machine that would actually tear her apart, leaving just her head remaining. Anyway, after this, her head would randomly be dragged away by this mechanical hand that we see here. So absolutely crucial scene here. Mommy dies, there's great animation, and an amazing finale to an amazing chapter. But the thing is, the important part that you should be paying attention to in this huge cinematic ending is the seemingly meaningless hand encounter that I just mentioned. Because the tapes throughout the chapter would actually reveal that this highly feared creature known as the prototype or Experiment 1006 was actually this small mechanical hand the entire time. Anyway, I'll touch more on this character here in a moment, but anyway, after this point, we actually save Poppy, and with a much more demented demeanor, she directs us to the train station once more where we enter the code and exit with her. And as mentioned, this doesn't actually go to plan, because right before the train ends up crashing at the end of the chapter, Poppy actually turns against us. And so it set things up as if Poppy was the next new villain. But this is not necessarily the actual ending that was meant for us to see, because the YouTube king of bugging and finding secrets within Poppy Playtime, Horoscoped, would discover that there was an entirely separate voice line in the end. Now, I'm not going to play the voice line, but if you want to hear it, I linked Horoscope's video in the description. But to summarize what was said, the difference between the new ending and the old one is that instead of turning against us, Poppy actually stays with us and explains a lot about the story. She reveals to us that all of the employees that we came to look for were entirely gone and that, quote, terrible things have happened. And Poppy even admits that all the experiments leading up to her becoming a doll are the reason that a ton of people ended up dying, which sort of indirectly confirms that she was the ideal experiment where her human form was turned into a doll in a successful instance, while of course all the other human experiments were killed. Poppy then ends this cut ending off by directing us to the next location called the Playcare, and we are told by her that we have the ability to fix everything that happened, and this first location is going to be the best place to start. So that's the end of this cut ending, but there's a few ways to interpret this new audio. The first one could be to brush this off as nothing because it was scrapped from the game and therefore none of it is relevant to the story anymore. Another way to look at this that isn't entirely plausible but does have a lot of evidence behind it is that maybe the Poppy Playtime team actually switched the story up to make it more accurate to the fan theories. And the reason why I think that is because Game Theory, pretty much the most popular video game theorist out there, had made two important videos about indie gaming. One that theorized about Poppy Playtime Chapter 2, where MatPat predicted that Poppy would end up turning against us after she uses us throughout the game. And then there's this video where he talks about how his own videos have negatively affected the indie gaming scene. More specifically in cases like Bendy and the Ink Machine, where after Game Theory convincingly predicted the entire story of Bendy and the Ink Machine before it was even out, the Bendy team had allegedly changed the entire story to keep the mystery of theorizing going. Anyway, that second video came out just a couple weeks before Chapter 2 came out, and I do find it a bit weird that entirely opposite to what MatPat said in the second video, the Poppy Playtime team have seemed to change the voice lines and lore to match his own theory. And the reason why I think that is because clearly a lot of thought went into the first cut ending of the game because they had to write it out, set up the scene, get the voice line recorded, and then implement it into their own game. But for whatever reason, they had to change the ending so last minute that they didn't even have time to remove it from the original game, which is just weird. Maybe they actually changed the story to match MatPat's theory after seeing this video to hopefully have the opposite effect of the Bendy games, but I'm most likely just overthinking it. The third theory about this ending, and the one that I think is the right theory, is that this cut dialogue revealed such a large amount of what Chapter 3 was going to contain that they cut it last minute to keep things more vague and to not give away too much until Chapter 3 comes out. Let me know which of those theories you believe the most in the comments. But now we know all this information about Chapter 2 and even some cut content. So what does all of this mean for Chapter 3 and what will that part of the game actually contain? Well, here is my theory. Chapter 3 is going to officially be the main discovery part of this game. The first tape that originally drove us into the factory had a note giving us the goal to find out what happened to the missing coworkers. But instead of us as the character actually searching for where all the coworkers may have went, we've more or less spent the majority of the game being focused on trying to survive all of these monsters with the story being a second thought. But getting this deep into the game, it seems like we'll finally start to take a deeper dive into the game's lore and finding out what actually happened to these employees. As Poppy said in the cut ending, the Playcare was going to be the best place to start looking for answers. And while of course it's hard to take that line seriously since it came from a part of the game that we weren't supposed to see, either way in the final version of the game we still see a sign on the train station that points to the exact same Playcare location in the map. So unless the developers have decided to entirely shift the purpose of this location, regardless we're going to be entering this zone at the beginning of Chapter 3 that is supposedly finally going to give us some answers. And that indirectly also confirms that the next location for Chapter 3 is going to be the Playcare, obviously. I imagine it's going to be something similar to Chapter 2 where we spend the entire game in a main area known as the game station in Chapter 2's case, and for Chapter 3 it's going to be the Playcare. But the next question here is, we've had Huggy in Chapter 1, Mommy Longlegs in Chapter 2, but who is going to be the next big antagonist for this chapter? Well, I mean, it could end up being Poppy herself after everything we hear at the end of the game, but while that could be the case, what I can almost assure you is that she's not the real main character of the game as it seems, or at least the main antagonist. Sure, she is the perfect experiment, the goal that all the other experiments failed to reach, and I mean, she's literally in the title of the game, but in a game all about running from monsters and solving mysteries to find out why all the toys that became demented, I don't think that the main character who we're going to end up fighting and being being the most afraid of is going to be the only one who doesn't want to tear our guts off. However, if I'm being honest, the most intimidating and dangerous creature of them all actually seems to be this menacing little hand thing here that we were talking about before. And the reason why I think this is because Poppy is the ideal version of the experiments, while this prototype hand thing over here is actually the exact opposite. He, and yes, according to all the tapes, this thing is a he, was the one that caused the most outrage back when the factory was still around. He was feared and he was deadly. I feel like while he may not be the chapter 3 main antagonist or even the 4th or 5th or anything like that, similar to what we've seen in games like Bendy and the Ink Machine, I feel like his prominent appearance in the game isn't going to be based on what we physically see of him, but rather what we've been discovering behind the scenes. I could even go as far as to say that he could be the most prominent character in the game entirely. And hey, while I guess we're going for absolute Hail Marys here, I might as well just say that I think it's possible he could even be the final boss of some sorts. I mean, after all, if we truthfully can somehow save the factory like Poppy says in the leaked dialogue, unless there's some sort of magical time-traveling potion, we're not going to be able to revive the already killed employees. But what we could do is seek revenge against the one who seems to be the most responsible for their disappearance. And I honestly think that the only reason that this animation at the end of the game even exists is just to show us that this prototype is still in the factory to this day. Meaning we may actually get the chance to save this factory in the future by taking charge against this human-killing machine and giving it what it deserves. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that this thing can definitely be killed. Because even in this small little 3D model that we see for just a brief second, we could see very distinct human features on the hand, most notably a bone, which basically proves that it's a living thing and, like the other ones, can be killed. Now, is this a stretch? Maybe. Would it be a pretty cool twist that most people wouldn't expect? I definitely think so. The only question I wonder from this point forward, though, is which of these employees was actually turned into this prototype? Because as mentioned, we know all these characters were all derived from humans, but I hope we eventually end up finding out which person unknowingly signed up to start the beginning of the end for Playtime Co. But that's something I'll leave for you guys to discuss in the comments below. In the meantime, check out my review on the gameplay aspects of Poppy Playtime, subscribe, and peace.